I want to begin this story not with feelings, but with real risk, with a concrete threat, with something that could completely destroy a man before God and before men. Because that is exactly how it all began, on a seemingly ordinary day in the land of Uz, when the heavens were open and something invisible to human eyes was being decided, while Job, unknowingly, walked among his flocks, felt the warmth of the sun on his face, and followed his routine as a righteous man, ignoring that at that very moment his life was being placed at the center of a spiritual conflict that would test not only his faith, but the very concept of human integrity in the face of suffering. For while he offered silent sacrifices for his children, the accuser stood before God, questioning whether a man's faithfulness could survive when everything was taken from him. And it is here that the tension arises, because nothing is more dangerous than having your life praised by God and at the same time observed by the accuser, without you knowing that something is about to collapse irreversibly. While Job lived as the most respected man in the East, surrounded by children, servants, full tents and fertile fields, his outward security concealed a truth that transcends generations, that prosperity is not synonymous with protection against chaos, and that a righteous life before God is not a guarantee of predictable days. Because in that ancient world, where a man's honor was measured by his descendants, his flocks, and his reputation, Job represented everything believed to be a sign of divine blessing. And precisely for this reason, his story becomes so disconcerting, for it begins to dismantle the false idea that suffering is always a direct response to sin, and leads us to a much deeper territory, where pain is not punishment but revelation, and where God allows the righteous to cross the valley not to destroy them, but to reveal something that even they do not yet know about themselves and about God. When I look at Job in that ancient setting, walking amidst the smell of dust, wool, and incense, I don't just see a distant biblical character. I see a man who did everything right according to what he was taught, a father who intercedes for his children even before knowing if they have erred, a leader who fears God not out of fear, but out of reverence. And it is precisely there that the spiritual psychology of the story begins to confront us, because Job was not only outwardly obedient, he was emotionally committed to the idea that God was just, predictable, and rewarding. And when this structure begins to crumble, it is not only his faith that enters a crisis, but his identity, his understanding of the world, and his inner security, something that happens to anyone who builds their life on certainties that have not yet been tested by profound suffering. There is something silent and unsettling in the fact that Job is not warned, does not receive dreams, does not listen to prophets, does not perceive signs. He simply lives, while in the invisible realm his story is placed on a celestial table. This teaches us something difficult to accept, but essential for emotional healing, that often the greatest battles of our lives begin without explanation, without preparation, and without consent, and that God's silence at the beginning is not abandonment, but part of a process we cannot yet understand. For if Job had known what was about to happen, perhaps his reaction would have been different, perhaps his faith would have been conditioned, and the story would have lost precisely what makes it so human, so painful, and so necessary. And this is where I need to pause for a moment and let this tension linger, because nothing has happened yet. No loss has been announced, no messenger has arrived running, no house has fallen, but something has already begun to move. Something that Job does not yet see. Something that you may not see in your own story either. And the question that echoes silently in this first moment is not about loss, but about foundation, about what sustains faith when everything still seems to be in order. And whether what you call trust in God would survive if the ground began to move beneath your feet, even without any warning. When the day began in the land of Uz, nothing in the sky foreshadowed what was about to happen, because the most devastating danger rarely announces its arrival with visible signs. And while Job walked among the servants, observing the movement of the animals, listening to the familiar sound of the sheep, and feeling the tranquil weight of a routine built over years of faithfulness, something invisible had already been unleashed. This is disturbing precisely because it reminds us that there are days when the external world remains intact while the invisible begins to dismantle everything. For at that very moment when Job was thinking of his children scattered in their homes, perhaps imagining their laughter echoing at banquets, Satan had already left God's presence with limited permission, carrying not only destructive intent, but a surgical attack on that which sustained the emotional and spiritual identity of that man. And this divine permission, which disturbs us so much, was not carelessness or cruelty, but a scenario where the truth about human faith would be brutally exposed, without prior explanations, without anesthesia, without warning. The first messenger appears running on the horizon, and I can imagine the dust rising behind his steps, his face contorted in panic, his breathing uneven, because bad news always arrives like this, violently interrupting normality. And when he bows before Job, the words come out like blades, describing stolen oxen, dead servants, blood on the ground. And before Job's mind can process the shock, another man approaches, and then another, and then another, forming a sequence almost too cruel to be human, as if time itself had been programmed not to allow space for assimilation, because profound suffering does not respect the rhythm of the soul, it runs over it. And while one messenger is still speaking, the other is already ready to announce that fire has fallen from the sky, that the sheep are lost, that the camels have been taken, that the servants have been murdered, and each phrase tears away a piece of Job's known world, dismantling in minutes what took decades to build. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepares the human heart for the final news, because there is a brutal difference between losing things and losing people, especially when those people are children, an extension of one's own flesh, a continuation of one's own history, and when the last messenger, almost without strength, speaks of the wind that came from the desert, of the house that fell, of the silence that followed the impact, and of the death of all the children, the text does not describe Job's cry. It does not describe immediate words, because there are pains that first leave us speechless. And this initial silence is perhaps the most honest expression of the soul in the face of absolute trauma. Because before any spiritual reaction, before any known phrase, there is an internal collapse, a profound disorientation, where the world ceases to make sense and the mind tries, in vain, to find a logic that does not exist. When Job rises, tears his robe, and shaves his head, he is not performing an automatic religious gesture. He is externalizing something that has exploded inside. Because in the ancient world, these acts were not performances, they were emotional language, the body saying what the mouth could not formulate. And when he prostrates himself on the ground, something extraordinary happens, not because the pain diminishes, but because he chooses a direction for his pain. This is a central point in the Christian psychology of suffering, because Job does not ignore what he has lost. He does not deny grief, he does not spiritualize the tragedy, but he directs the collapse of his soul toward God, not as one who understands, but as one who knows that there is nowhere else to go when everything crumbles. And when he says that he came naked and naked, he will return, he is not citing a beautiful principle. He is trying to anchor his mind to something firm while everything spins. This choice doesn't make him immune to pain, but it prevents him from becoming bitter in that initial moment. And this teaches us something profound, that true faith doesn't prevent shock, doesn't prevent grief, doesn't prevent the initial emotional collapse, but it creates a limit, an invisible boundary that prevents pain from immediately turning into blasphemy or total abandonment. And even then, this limit will still be tested because Job's suffering is only beginning, and what has been lost externally will now give way to something even more difficult: the internal erosion of hope, the feeling that God himself has become distant, and the slow deconstruction of the certainties that once sustained his spiritual life. While the heavens remain silent and the earth absorbs the impact of these losses, a question begins to silently form, not only in Job, but in anyone who has ever lost much without explanation. And that question is not why, not yet, but how far will this go? Because human beings can endure losses when they believe there is a limit, but when suffering begins to seem limitless, the soul enters a state of deep alert, and something begins to brew within Job, something he cannot yet name, but which will lead him to confront God in a way he never imagined possible. As time passes and the ashes are still cold beneath Job's body, something new begins to happen. Something that doesn't arrive as a sudden blow, but as a slow, persistent, and humiliating invasion, because physical suffering begins to take shape, and I can imagine the first sign, perhaps a burning sensation on the skin, a discomfort that seemed too small to compete with the grief, but which persists, grows, and spreads until open wounds begin to appear, covering the body of that man who was once respected, healthy, and whole, and now finds himself reduced to someone who needs to sit outside the city, far from the tents, far from the people, scraping his own skin with a piece of broken clay, not only to alleviate the pain, but because social dignity had also been stripped away, since in that ancient world, visible illness was interpreted as a sign of divine disapproval, and every distant gaze, every heavy silence, reinforced the feeling of abandonment. Physical suffering has a cruel characteristic because it allows no distraction, grants no breaks, does not respect mourning, and while Job's body becomes a map of pain, his mind begins to enter an even more dangerous territory, where unanswered questions begin to echo during the long nights when sleep does not come, when dreams turn into torment, and the silence of God becomes deafening. For there is a point in human suffering where the absence of explanations hurts more than the physical pain itself. And Job begins to experience this emptiness, this feeling of speaking to heaven and hearing only the echo of his own voice, something that slowly corrodes hope, not explosively, but like water that wears away stone. It is in this state of extreme vulnerability that one of the most painful scenes in the entire narrative emerges, when Job's wife, equally affected by the loss of her children, the destruction of her home, and social humiliation, approaches him and utters words that do not stem from malice, but from absolute despair. Because when she asks how long he will maintain his integrity and invites him to curse God and die, she is not merely suggesting blasphemy. She is verbalizing what many souls think, but do not have the courage to say, that there is a point where living seems more cruel than dying, and that continuing to believe in a silent God may seem like a way of prolonging one's own emotional torture. This harsh speech reveals how suffering also affects those around, distorting perspectives, weakening resistance, and creating fissures in the most intimate relationships. Job's response, however, does not stem from physical strength or emotional clarity, but from something deeper, from a conviction that has not yet been destroyed. When he states that if they receive good from God, they must also receive evil, he is not minimizing pain or calling suffering good, but recognizing that his relationship with God cannot be based solely on what is comfortable. And here Christian psychology offers us a difficult truth. Mature faith is not that which understands everything, but that which remains even when it understands nothing. Job, even wounded, confused, and emotionally exhausted, still refuses to transform his pain into a direct accusation against God, not because he lacks the will, but because something within him still holds that invisible boundary between questioning and cursing. When the friends finally arrive, after hearing rumors of what happened, the narrative slows down almost solemnly, because seeing Job from afar, they barely recognize him. And this detail is devastating, as it shows how much suffering has disfigured him, not only physically, but socially. And when they tear their robes, throw dust on their heads, and sit with him in silence for 7 days and 7 nights, there is a rare moment of true empathy, because before speaking they weep, before explaining they remain. And for a brief period, the silence is more therapeutic than any discourse, because profound pain needs to be acknowledged before it can be interpreted. But this silence does not last forever. And when Job finally opens his mouth, it is not to praise, not to give thanks, not to repeat known truths, but to curse the day of his birth. And this marks a crucial turning point in the story, because now suffering ceases to be merely something that happens to him and becomes something that emanates from him, in words laden with anguish, revealing that faith did not annul his emotional pain, only postponed its explosion, and what begins to emerge from. Here is an intense struggle between what Job has always believed about God and what his current experience seems to deny, creating a tension that is still far from being resolved. And while the sky remains silent and friends prepare to respond, the question that hangs in the air is no longer about material or physical losses, but about meaning, about justice, about whether there is any sense when the righteous suffer without explanation. And this question, still unanswered, begins to deepen, preparing the ground for verbal, emotional, and spiritual confrontations that will test not only Job, but everyone around him, including those who believe they have ready answers for the pain of others. When Job finally breaks the silence after those 7 days and 7 nights sitting on the ashes, what emerges from his lips is not a structured prayer, nor a direct accusation, but a raw lament, as ancient as humanity itself, because there, in that scene of dust, open wounds, and heavy gazes, he does not speak as a theologian. He speaks as a man crushed by existence, and in cursing the day of his birth, he is not consciously rejecting God, but rejecting the very experience of being alive under a weight that has become unbearable. For there are pains that do not ask for explanation. They ask for interruption. And when Job wishes that the day he was born be erased from creation, shrouded in darkness, he is verbalizing something that many feel in silence, the desire to have never begun when the end seems too cruel. And this shows us that the Bible does not romanticize pain. It exposes it with almost disconcerting honesty. As he speaks, it's possible to feel the stark contrast between the man who once offered sacrifices for the possible guilt of his children and now questions why he didn't die at birth. This profound suffering has the power to pierce through all layers of superficial faith and reach the core of identity, making a person not only ask where God is, but question the value of their own life. And when Job describes death as rest, as a place where groans cease, where the weary rest and the oppressed are no longer persecuted, he is not glorifying death, but denouncing how life has become too heavy to bear. This reveals an important psychological dimension, that faith doesn't automatically eliminate dark thoughts, but offers a safe space where they can be expressed without God abandoning the dialogue. Hearing this lament, the friends feel compelled to respond, and it is Eliphaz who breaks the silence, bringing with him not only words, but an entire worldview built on the idea that suffering is always a direct consequence of error. When he reminds Job that he was once a comforter to many, but now is troubled by his own pain, there is a truth mixed with harshness, because Eliphaz does not speak as someone who wants to hurt, but as someone who needs to preserve an internal logic where God remains predictable. To admit that a righteous person suffers without cause would be to admit that the world is not as controllable as he believed, and that is too frightening for someone who relies on spiritual formulas. Christian psychology delves deeper here because Job's friends represent something very common. People who speak general truths out of context, offering quick explanations for deep pain, not out of malice, but out of an inability to remain in the mystery. And when Eliphaz states that he has never seen an innocent person perish, he is not describing reality, but defending a belief that protects him from chaos. This teaches us that religious judgment often stems from fear, the fear that the pain of others will reveal the fragility of our own certainties, causing empathy to be replaced by correct but empty discourses. Job, in his response, does not reject God, but rejects the superficiality of explanations because he knows that his pain cannot be contained in ready-made answers. When he speaks of the intensity of his suffering as something heavier than the sand of the seas, he is trying to communicate the incommunicable, the inner experience of someone who feels directly struck by God, not in the sense of conscious punishment, but in the real impact of what happened. This creates a profound tension because Job does not abandon his faith, but begins to dialogue with God from the wound, no longer from stability, and this type of faith is uncomfortable for those who prefer a spirituality without difficult questions. Nothing was resolved, no explanation satisfied, no pain was relieved, and the heavens remain silent while words begin to accumulate like layers of dust on Job's heart, preparing the ground for even more intense confrontations, where not only suffering will be debated, but God's own justice will be called into question. And the question that remains unanswered is not whether Job sinned, but whether human beings can remain faithful when logic crumbles and God's presence seems too distant to be felt. As Eliphaz continues to speak, his voice takes on an even more confident, almost pastoral tone, like someone who sincerely believes he is offering medicine, but who in reality begins to press on an open wound, because he cannot remain merely a companion in pain. He needs to be an interpreter of suffering, and this changes everything. From the moment the other's pain needs to fit into my explanation, comfort ceases to be presence and becomes veiled judgment. I can imagine Job listening to those words while the desert wind blows through the ashes, feeling his body burn, his mind weary, and realizing that something has begun to shift, because now it was not only God who remained silent, but the men closest to him began to speak too much, filling the void with certainties that did not heal, only tightened the heart even more. Eliphaz speaks of divine discipline, of loving correction, of a God who wounds but also heals, and in another context these words might sound like hope, but there, at that specific moment, they carried a devastating implicit assumption that Job was going through all that because he needed to be corrected. And Christian psychology reveals here a dangerous mechanism when we use general truths to explain specific pains, because this transfers the weight of suffering from the mystery of God to the guilt of man. Job begins to realize that, in the eyes of his friends, his pain had already been interpreted, catalogued, and closed, even without him having been truly heard. This generates an even deeper kind of loneliness, the loneliness of not being understood even by those who came to comfort him. While Eliphaz describes a future of restoration conditioned on accepting discipline, promising harvests, children, peace, and longevity, Job remains seated in silence, because there are promises that do not console when the present is in ruins. This teaches us something essential about the human soul. It cannot receive future hope when current pain has not been acknowledged. In that ancient world, where honor and blessing were directly linked to visible prosperity, hearing that everything could be restored sounded almost like an indirect accusation, as if the message were that restoration had not yet happened only because Job had not done something correctly. This idea begins to corrode his soul, not because he sees himself as guilty, but because he feels unfairly judged. When Job finally responds, his words are not explosive, but dense, laden with a profound weariness because he's no longer trying to convince his friends of his innocence. He is trying to express the inner weight of pain, something that doesn't fit into simple moral categories. And when he says that his anguish is heavier than the sand of the seas, he is not using poetic hyperbole, but trying to translate an emotional experience where every breath requires effort, every night seems endless, and every explanation offered sounds empty. This reveals that prolonged suffering not only hurts, it exhausts, and an exhausted heart does not react with immediate anger, but with a kind of deep sadness that mixes with a desire to cease, to stop, to rest from existing. Job's response to his friends exposes a significant relational wound because he accuses them of being like dry streams that promise water but disappear in the heat. This image is powerful because it reveals that the expectation of comfort only made the disappointment greater. And this often happens in human experience, when we expect support and receive analysis, when we seek embrace and receive a lesson. Job is not asking his friends to solve his pain. He is asking them not to turn it into an accusation, not to use it as proof of a rigid theology that admits no exceptions. This statement reveals that one of the greatest pains of suffering is not what we lose, but how we are treated while we suffer. At this point in the narrative, something definitively begins to change within Job, because he stops dialoguing only with his friends and begins to direct his speech directly to God, not in formal prayer, but in open complaint, in a raw exposition of his soul. This marks an important transition because now the story ceases to be just about a man who suffers and becomes about a man who dares to take his pain to God, without filters, without ready-made phrases, without fear of seeming irreverent. This creates a growing tension, because while this honesty brings people closer, it also opens space for even deeper confrontations with divine justice, confrontations that still find no answer. Job remains faithful, but not comfortable. He remains upright, but not satisfied. He continues to believe, but now believing amidst ceaseless questions. God's silence, coupled with the harsh words of his friends, begins to prepare the ground for an even greater confrontation, where not only suffering will be discussed, but the very meaning of justice, faith, and relationship with God will be put to the test. The question that hangs in the air is not whether Job will be restored, but whether he will be able to get through this process without losing what still keeps him standing inside. When Job begins to speak directly to God, something changes in the invisible atmosphere of that ancient scene, because it is no longer just a man debating ideas with friends, but a wounded creature daring to take his pain to the Creator without adornment, without defenses, and without filters. I can imagine the heavy silence that forms around them, the wind stirring up dust, the friends watching from a distance, perhaps uncomfortable, perhaps scandalized, because Job does not adopt the expected respectful tone. He does not begin by extolling divine attributes. He begins by exposing his exhaustion, saying that his soul is weary of life. This reveals something profoundly human and spiritually honest. For there is a point in suffering where prayer ceases to be formal and becomes survival, where speaking to God is not an act of quiet devotion, but a last thread of relationship that still prevents the heart from closing completely. Job describes his nights as endless, his days as too fleeting to bring relief, and his body as a territory invaded by pain. These descriptions are not literary exaggerations, but desperate attempts to make God understand what it is to live within a flesh that aches and a mind that does not rest. because the psychology of prolonged suffering shows that when pain finds no meaning, it begins to corrode the perception of identity, making the individual feel like a constant target, observed, watched, corrected with every breath. And when Job asks why God has made him a target, he is not accusing him of rebellion, but trying to understand why his existence has become a battlefield. This question resonates with anyone who has ever suffered without understanding why. While Job speaks, his friends listen, but they no longer listen with empathy. They listen with the desire to respond. And it is Bildad who now rises, bringing with him the tradition of the ancients, the authority of the past, and a worldview where God would never allow suffering without guilt. By insinuating that even Job's children might have sinned, he crosses an invisible boundary, because now the pain ceases to be merely debated and becomes morally interpreted in a cruel way. This further deepens Job's wound, for there is nothing more devastating to a grieving heart than to hear that the death of his children was deserved, even if this idea comes packaged in religious language and respected tradition. Christian psychology here reveals something harsh. Spiritual legalism often stems from the fear of admitting that life is more complex than our formulas. Bildad isn't just talking about God, he's defending a structure that protects him from chaos. Because if Job is innocent, then anyone can suffer unjustly, and that makes the world too insecure for someone who needs to believe that everything is predictable. Therefore, his words sound correct but lack mercy, and Job perceives this not as someone who rejects divine justice, but as someone who feels his pain is being used as proof of a theory, and not treated as a living wound. When Job responds, he does not deny God's greatness. On the contrary, he exalts it with words that send shivers down the spine, speaking of mountains that move, stars that obey, and heavens that stretch over nothing. But at the same time, he acknowledges something terrifying, that before such a magnificent God, man has no way to defend himself, no way to present arguments, no way to prove his innocence. This generates a profound internal conflict because Job believes in divine justice, but finds no space to be heard within it. This feeling of spiritual impotence is one of the most intense pains of faith, when a person does not abandon God, but feels that God has become unreachable. At this point in the narrative, a desire arises in Job's heart that changes everything. The desire for a mediator, someone who can intercede with both God and man, someone who can translate human pain to the divine tribunal and divine justice to the wounded heart. This idea, launched almost like a sigh, reveals an embryonic hope, still fragile, still formless, but profoundly significant, because it shows that even amidst the confusion, Job does not give up on the relationship. He does not want to flee from God. He wants to draw near without being crushed, and this points to something greater that he cannot yet fully perceive. Job still speaks, still asks, still remains exposed, while the heavens remain silent, and this absence of response is not rejection, but preparation, because the story has not yet reached the point of revelation, and suffering continues its slow and painful work, dismantling superficial certainties to reveal something deeper. And the question that remains suspended is not whether God is just, but whether humankind can continue seeking this God when justice seems too distant to be felt, and when the only thing left is the courage to continue speaking, even without an answer. As the debate continues and words no longer alleviate but accumulate weight on Job's heart, something within him begins to shift irreversibly, because now he is no longer merely reacting to the pain. He is being shaped by it, and this is perceptible in the way his speech becomes firmer, less defensive, and more aware that his friends are not there to understand, but to win an invisible argument. I can imagine that ancient setting becoming increasingly dense, the sun slowly advancing over the stones, the smell of dust mingling with that of wounds, and Job sitting there not as a defeated man, but as someone who begins to realize that his real struggle is not against those men, but against a vision of God that does not allow for mystery, innocent suffering, or prolonged silence. When Zophar rises, his voice carries neither compassion nor hesitation, but indignation, because to him Job's speech is dangerous, almost offensive, since questioning divine justice sounds like intolerable arrogance. By accusing him of talking too much and hiding sin under beautiful words, Zophar reveals something profound about the human heart, the difficulty of dealing with someone who suffers without accepting simple labels. For if Job is right in his integrity, then all retributive logic weakens, and this forces the observer to admit that it is not always possible to explain pain. Zophar is not willing to accept this, so he chooses to accuse, stating that God is still being merciful by not punishing Job as he truly deserves. These words fall like salt on an open wound, because now the pain is no longer just suffering, it is spiritual humiliation. Christian psychology reveals here that when religion is used as an emotional defense against chaos, it becomes cruel, because it transforms the other into a negative example to preserve an internal sense of security. Job perceives this with painful clarity, for upon hearing conditional promises of restoration based on repentance that he does not recognize as necessary, he understands that his friends are no longer interested in listening to him, only in silencing him. This leads him to a decisive point where he abandons any attempt to please, to explain himself, or to appear acceptable, and begins to speak with an almost disconcerting freedom, not to provoke, but because he has nothing left to lose. When Job responds, his irony is not empty mockery, but a defense mechanism of someone reduced to a caricature of a sinner. By saying that wisdom would die with his friends, he exposes how hollow religious discourse can become when disconnected from human reality. Then he does something powerful. He points to creation, to the animals, to the earth, to the heavens, affirming that all of nature knows that life and death are in God's hands. With this, he dismantles the idea that divine control can be reduced to immediate rewards, showing that the same God who sustains everything also allows temporary imbalances that escape human comprehension. This vision broadens the spiritual horizon of the narrative, shifting the focus from human merit to divine sovereignty. At this point, Job makes it clear that his deepest desire is not to justify himself before men, but to present his case before God. And this distinction is fundamental because it reveals that his faith has not become cynical or distant. It has become bolder, more honest, more raw. By calling his friends useless physicians, he is not rejecting friendship, but denouncing a spirituality that prefers to explain pain rather than remain in it. This directly confronts us, showing that we often speak in God's name without reflecting on whether God would truly speak that way to someone who is broken. As Job speaks, his discourse transforms into a universal lament, describing human frailty, the brevity of life, the inevitability of death, and he compares man to a withering flower, to a passing shadow. These images are not empty poetry, but a lucid recognition that human existence is limited, fragile, and constantly threatened. In wishing to be hidden in the grave until divine wrath passes, Job reveals a strange, paradoxical hope that even death could be a temporary refuge. This shows how his pain has reached an existential level, where living and dying are no longer clear opposites, but parts of the same cry for rest and justice. Job still stands inwardly, though physically prostrate, because despite all the accusations, he retains something intact, his refusal to lie about himself to please God or men. This prepares the ground for something new that has not yet manifested itself. For when all familiar voices fail, when friends become accusers, and heaven remains closed, something different begins to form in the silence, something that does not come from tradition or human logic, but from a deeper place. And the question that remains suspended is whether this silence will continue to be absolute, or whether something unexpected is about to rise up to break the rigid logic that dominates that circle of pain. As Job's words continue to echo in the heavy air of that place, something begins to definitively break between him and his friends, because there is no longer common ground where pain can be shared without judgment, and I can feel the almost physical change in the atmosphere, as if the silence ceases to be respectful and becomes tense, laden with expectation and irritation. For Job no longer speaks to be understood. He speaks because he needs to remain true before God, even if it costs him the approval of men, and this choice marks a point of no return. For from here, he consciously accepts isolation as the price of integrity, something profoundly painful in a culture where honor and belonging were essential for emotional and social survival. When the friends resume speaking, they do so with less patience and more rigidity, reinforcing the idea that God would never pervert judgment and that if there is suffering, it necessarily points to human failing. This argument, repeated with variations, begins to reveal its true function, not to explain God, but to end the conversation. Admitting that the righteous suffer without cause would open the door to questions that no one there is willing to face. Thus, the friend's insistence becomes an attempt to silence Job, to push him into a confession he doesn't recognize as true. This spiritual pressure creates an invisible violence where suffering ceases to be merely endured and becomes imposed as guilt. Job's response, however, no longer stems from an attempt at defense, but from a painful clarity, for he begins to realize that his friends do not speak in the name of God, but in the name of a system that must function without exception. By asserting that God is too great to fit into their explanations, Job dismantles the false security of religious formulas, reminding them that the same God who sustains the heavens also allows temporary injustices that are not resolved immediately. And this does not diminish his sovereignty. On the contrary, it amplifies it, making it both frightening and sublime, because a totally predictable God would be smaller than chaos. And Job begins to understand this, even without being able to find solace. At this point, Christian psychology reveals an important internal transition, because Job no longer seeks immediate relief. He seeks meaning. And when meaning doesn't come, he chooses to remain honest, refusing to feign repentance just to end the suffering. This directly confronts us because it exposes how often we prefer a false peace to painful truth. Job refuses to pay that price, even if it prolongs his pain, because for him, living a lie before God would be worse than suffering in truth. This silent choice becomes a profound form of faith, albeit marked by anguish. While Job speaks of human frailty, the brevity of life and the certainty of death, he does not do so as someone who has completely lost hope, but as someone who begins to see existence without illusions, recognizing that man is born for only a few days and full of restlessness. These words are not a sign of resignation, but of lucidity, because by accepting the limits of the human condition, Job frees himself from the obligation to explain everything, opening space for a relationship with God that does not depend on guarantees, only on presence, even when that presence is not yet manifested in a tangible way. Although nothing was resolved, something new began to form, a painful maturity, a faith stripped of immediate rewards, and a heart that, even wounded, chooses not to turn away, but to remain before God with all that it is, including its questions. This posture prepares the way for something unexpected, because when all human voices fail, when explanations run out and pain remains, silence ceases to be emptiness and becomes a premonition. The question that remains suspended is not whether Job will be understood by men, but whether he is ready to hear something that will not come in the form of answers, but of revelation. As Job continues to speak, there is no longer any attempt at mediation with his friends, because something within him understands that that circle of men has ceased to be a space for listening and has become a tribunal. I can imagine how he raises his gaze, not to seek approval, but to sustain his own soul before a God who seems distant. For at this point in the story, Job is not trying to win an argument. He is trying to survive spiritually without becoming someone he doesn't recognize. This requires silent courage, because remaining faithful to one's inner truth when everyone around challenges it is one of the loneliest experiences a human being can have, especially in a culture where community defines who you are. In acknowledging God's absolute greatness, Job does not do so to diminish himself theatrically, but to confess something terrifying: that before a God so powerful, so unreachable, and so sovereign, man does not possess sufficient instruments to defend his own cause. When he describes mountains that move, stars that obey, seas that are contained by divine command, he is affirming that he does not question God's power. What he questions is how such a magnificent being relates to someone so fragile. This tension reveals a profound spiritual pain, because Job feels crushed not by human injustice, but by the asymmetry between the Creator and the creature, where there is no room for just argument, only for silent submission, something that frightens him as much as physical pain itself. Christian psychology delves even deeper here, because Job expresses what many fear to admit: that faith can also generate fear when God seems too distant to be accessed emotionally. By stating that even being innocent, his own mouth could condemn him before God, he reveals a feeling of spiritual powerlessness, where divine justice, though perfect, seems unattainable for those who suffer. This creates intense existential anguish, because Job is not denying God. He is confessing that he does not know how to approach him without being destroyed. This radical honesty breaks with any superficial spirituality. While his friends insist on a simple retributive logic, Job observes the reality around him and realizes that the world doesn't work in that immediate way. For he sees the wicked prospering, the innocent suffering, and injustices remaining seemingly uncorrected. This observation doesn't stem from cynicism, but from painful lucidity, because denying what the eyes see would be lying to oneself, and Job refuses to do so, even if it puts him in direct conflict with the dominant religious tradition. Here we learn something essential. Mature faith is not that which ignores reality, but that which faces it without abandoning God, even when that reality seems to contradict everything that has been taught. It is in this context that Job expresses a desire that echoes like a silent cry through the generations. The desire for a mediator, someone who can lay a hand on God and on man at the same time, someone who can reduce the distance, who can translate divine greatness to a wounded heart and human pain to a heavenly court. This desire is not blasphemy. It is embryonic hope, still confused, still formless, but profoundly revealing, because it shows that even at the height of anguish, Job does not want to flee from God. He wants to meet him without being crushed by his own insignificance. This points to something that has not yet fully manifested itself in that story, but which is already beginning to take shape within human faith. Job remained in that uncomfortable place between reverence and questioning, between fear and a desire for closeness. without answers, without immediate relief, but also without giving up. Because although everything around him seemed to crumble, something essential remained intact: his refusal to transform God into an enemy or a formula. And this stance, however painful, prepares the way for a revelation that will not come as a logical explanation, but as an encounter. The question that remains unanswered is not whether God will answer, but whether the human heart is willing to listen when the answer does not come in the expected way. When I look at Job at this point in the story, I no longer see just the man who lost flocks and children, nor just the sick man covered in sores who sits outside the city so as not to contaminate the routine of others. I see a man being pushed into an inner place where no rehearsed phrase can sustain him, because prolonged suffering has its own weight. It doesn't arrive like a single blade. It arrives like a stone placed on the chest day after day. And at some point, the soul realizes that it's not just the physical pain that's burning, but the feeling of living under a closed sky, as if the Almighty were present and absent at the same time, too invisible to be reached, too silent to be interpreted. And that's why, when Job opens his mouth, he doesn't begin with praise, nor with organized requests. He begins with the most difficult confession a pious man could make without abandoning God, saying that his soul is weary of life. And I feel the density of this phrase not as rebellion, but as exhaustion, because there is a weariness that is neither laziness nor lack of faith. It is weariness of someone trying to breathe while each breath feels like a test. And this happens in that ancient world, with dust clinging to sweat, with the smell of ash mixed with dried blood, with skin burning as if it were charcoal, and with the eyes of friends still fixed on him, not to comfort but to measure. So Job does something that disconcerts me and at the same time heals me, because he decides to speak to God as one speaks to the only one who can truly bear the whole truth. And he remembers the womb, the clay, the invisible care with which the Creator weaves life, as if each bone had been placed intentionally, each tendon delicately tied, each breath lit like a lamp that only God knows how to light. And his question arises from this terrible contrast. For if it was God who formed him, why does he now seem to undo his own work? Why does the same God who gave form now behave as one who crushes? And this question is dangerous because it touches the heart of the relationship, but it is also necessary because it reveals a spiritual principle that many avoid. That faith is not only the ability to accept good, it is the courage to bring confusion to the Lord when evil seems disproportionate. And Job is not saying that God is unjust as a final judgment. He is saying that his experience is that of someone being treated as a target. And when a righteous man feels targeted, it is not only the body that it hurts, it's about meaning, it's about identity, it's about the memory of who he was before everything fell apart. Job continues, and his speech becomes a kind of reverse trial, not because he is trying to put God in the dock out of arrogance, but because he finds no other way to remain alive inside. He asks if God observes him as one man observes another, if the Almighty looks for flaws as a debt collector looks for debts, if God's eyes are eyes of flesh that grow impatient and record every step only to later accuse. I recognize in this question a common fear of the wounded heart, the fear that God is not a refuge but a persecutor. Christian psychology comes into play here forcefully because when suffering is not understood, the mind tries to create explanations to avoid going insane, and one of these explanations is to imagine that God is against us, not out of truth, but out of a desperate attempt to find a cause. Job exposes this mechanism before God himself, as if saying, "If I have sinned, show me. If I have erred, reveal it to me, but do not destroy me in the dark, because nothing is more torturous than being wounded without knowing why, and nothing is more It's more corrosive than feeling that heaven has a reason and refuses to say it. And then Job's speech changes tone, because when the soul tires of seeking explanation, it begins to seek only a respite. And it is here that I feel the scene becomes even more human, because Job no longer asks for restoration, no longer asks for prosperity, no longer asks for the dead to return. He asks for a small space to breathe, a brief averted gaze, a moment of truce before descending to the land of shadows. And this teaches me that there is a prayer that is not beautiful, but is true. The prayer of someone who is at their limit and says, "Let me at least breathe." And this is not a lack of faith, it is sincerity before the God who knows the fragility of the creature. For in that ancient world, man knew that his life was like a breath in the desert. And Job is saying that his breath is weak, that he feels consumed like rotten wood, like gnawed fabric. And when he speaks of the grave as destiny, he is not exalting death. He is confessing that life has lost its color and the night has become too long to endure without any sign. God's silence continues, and this silence doesn't seem neutral to those who suffer. It feels like a wall. I can imagine Job finishing his words and the wind passing by as an answer, his friends shifting restlessly as if needing to correct his tone. And yet the heavens don't open, because the story is moving towards a kind of encounter that won't come as an immediate explanation, but as a revelation that demands all false security be dismantled first. And Job, without realizing it, is being led to a deeper faith than the one he had when everything was well, a faith that doesn't depend on guarantees, formulas, or quick rewards, but on an inner courage to stand before God with the whole truth, even when the truth includes fear, confusion, and weariness. And the question that lingers in the air, like dust suspended under the bright light of the east, is whether Job will be able to continue seeking God's face without transforming this silence into hatred, and whether the silence itself will not, in fact, be the anteroom of a voice that will come when no one else has human answers to offer. When Job finishes speaking and silence returns, spreading like dust suspended under the eastern sun, I sense that this silence is no longer the same as in the early days, because now it doesn't carry compassion, it carries tension, almost like a rope stretched too far, ready to break. This is evident in the motionless bodies, in the gazes that no longer avoid confrontation, in the restrained breathing of the men who came to console and now seem disturbed by what they heard. Because hearing Job speak to God like this didn't just sadden them, it threatened them, threatened the way they understand the world, justice, faith, and their own spiritual security. And in this charged atmosphere, where pain no longer finds refuge, Zophar rises not as someone grieving, but as someone who needs to restore an order that in his eyes has been violated. Zophar begins to speak hastily and harshly, as if the mere fact that so many words have been spoken without immediate punishment were an affront. When he questions whether so much talk will go unanswered, I realize that it is not Job who bothers him, but God's silence in the face of Job's words. For Zophar, a just God should immediately correct anyone who dares to question, and if this does not happen, someone needs to assume that role. Thus he positions himself as a defender of God, but in reality, he is defending a spiritual system that does not tolerate ambiguity. When he states that God demands less from Job than he deserves, this statement does not stem from holy zeal, but from a deep fear that the suffering of a righteous man will reveal that life does not function through simple exchanges. And this idea is unbearable for someone who has built their faith on predictable rewards. Christian psychology becomes painfully clear here, because Zophar represents the type of spirituality that prefers to hurt the other rather than admit mystery, since mystery generates insecurity, and insecurity threatens the illusion of control. Therefore, he exalts the unfathomable greatness of God, not to draw closer, but to silence, as if to say that a God so high cannot be questioned by someone so wounded. This creates a distorted image of the Almighty, not as a father who listens, but as an unreachable judge who demands silence. Job feels this weight not only as an accusation, but as spiritual exclusion, as if his pain had made him unworthy of dialogue. And nothing is more devastating to a wounded heart than to hear that even his questions are sin. When Job responds, there is no longer any attempt at reconciliation, because he understands that his friends do not want to listen to him, they want to frame him, and his irony arises not as contempt, but as a defense of his own identity, for accepting that accusation would be to deny everything he experienced before God, before the fall. And he declares that he is not inferior to them in wisdom, dismantling the claim that only those who do not suffer have spiritual authority. And then Job does something even more profound. He looks at the world around him and says what everyone sees, but few dare to say, that the wicked often prosper, that those who provoke God live in safety, that there are injustices that remain without immediate correction. And this is not blasphemy, it is honesty, because denying reality does not glorify God, it only protects a fragile theology. At this point, Job shifts the focus of the conversation to a higher plane, asserting that all creation knows that life and death are in God's hands. In doing so, he dismantles the idea that divine sovereignty can be reduced to automatic rewards, revealing a God who governs above human formulas. This vision is both frightening and liberating because it removes from humanity the false security of controlling the future through behavior, but also restores to God the grandeur that the religious system had domesticated. Job prefers to live before this sovereign and mysterious God rather than before a predictable God who demands lies to function. And this choice marks a painful maturation of faith, where remaining upright becomes more important than being accepted. There is no longer any possible dialogue between Job and his friends, since they need him to confess to a non-existent guilt so that the world can make sense again, and he needs to preserve his truth even if it leaves him alone. At this point, the story makes it clear that suffering is not only physical or emotional, but also spiritual and relational, because Job now suffers not only for what he has lost, but for being misunderstood in his pain. The question that remains suspended, heavy as the air before a desert storm, is not whether Job will yield, but whether God will allow human accusation to have the last word, or whether something greater is being prepared in silence to interrupt this cycle with a revelation that none of them can anticipate. When I imagine Job again at this point in the story, I no longer see him merely as a physically wounded man, but as someone who began to understand that prolonged pain doesn't just destroy the body, it alters a person's position in the world, because those who suffer for a long time cease to be seen as equals, cease to be heard as sources of wisdom, and become observed as living warnings. This changes everything, as Job realizes that his friends no longer speak to him, but about him, as if he had become an object of spiritual analysis, a case to be explained, corrected, or discarded. At that moment, something profound breaks, because the pain ceases to be shared and begins to be judged. And when that happens, the silence becomes heavier than any explicit accusation. Job then breaks this silence with words that seek neither applause nor pity, but truth, and by saying that he has become a laughingstock to those who live in security, he exposes a cruel reality of human experience, which is the silent contempt that the comfortable harbor for those who fall, for those who have never faced ruin, tend to believe that stability is the result of merit, and therefore the suffering of others sounds like proof of error. And I can imagine the averted glances, the muffled laughter, the whispered comments that transform pain into a spectacle, and this wounds deeper than any physical wound, because it strikes at dignity. It strikes at the memory of what Job was, the respected man at the city gate, listened to, honored, sought for advice, and now reduced to a negative example of a theology that needs scapegoats to survive. This social humiliation is not a detail, it is a central part of the suffering, because human beings endure material loss more easily than they endure the loss of value in the eyes of others, and Job feels this with bitter clarity. He is not only ignored, he is ridiculed, and this reveals a deep psychological mechanism where the suffering of others functions as a mirror of collective fear. To admit that a righteous man can fall without cause would be to admit that no one is safe, and to avoid this terror, those who are steadfast prefer to mock, accuse, or simplify, transforming the tragedy of others into a moral lesson. Job, with painful lucidity, perceives that his pain is being used to soothe the consciences of others. Upon recognizing this, Job does not become closed off in resentment, but broadens his perspective. And here his faith begins to take on a deeper form because he realizes that if he depends on human validation, his soul will be crushed. So he turns to something greater, pointing to creation, to the animals, to the birds, to the earth and the seas, affirming that all of existence knows that life is in God's hands. With this, he shifts the focus of the conversation, removing from men the power to define who he is, reminding them that it is not religious discourses nor social judgments that sustain the world, but the sovereign will of the Creator. This change of perspective is fundamental to the spiritual survival of those who suffer unjustly. In this process, Job begins to understand that God's sovereignty doesn't fit into human systems of immediate reward. And this is uncomfortable because it dismantles the illusion of control, but it is also liberating because it restores to God the greatness that the formulas had diminished. Job prefers a sovereign and mysterious God to a predictable God who demands lies to function, because he understands that living in truth before God is more important than maintaining an acceptable appearance before men. This choice doesn't eliminate pain, but it preserves integrity, something that begins to become more precious than any material restoration. As he speaks, Job makes it clear that he is not inferior to his friends in understanding, but that the experience of suffering has led him to see beyond easy certainties, and this creates a chasm between him and those who have never had to traverse the dark night of the soul, for there are truths that are only revealed when everything falls apart, and there are questions that only arise when the ground disappears, and Job now inhabits this uncomfortable place where faith is no longer sustained by inherited traditions, but by a daily decision to stand before God without masks, even when it means loneliness and incomprehension. Job continues to be ridiculed, continues to be misunderstood, but something within him begins to solidify, not as triumphant certainty, but as silent resistance. For he understands that his story will not be defined by the laughter of men, nor by hasty judgments, but by a God who sees beyond appearances. And although this God still remains silent, Job chooses not to abandon the truth he carries, even if it costs him reputation, belonging, and comfort. And so, in the midst of scorn and pain, a deeper, more solitary, and more real faith begins to form. A faith that does not need to be understood to exist. After all that has been said, after the accusations disguised as zeal and the frustrated attempts to frame his pain within old formulas, Job reaches an inner point where something definitively closes and something new opens, because he realizes that continuing to debate with men no longer produces light, only weariness. And I can imagine this moment not as an emotional outburst, but as a deep and silent weariness, the kind of exhaustion that no longer screams, only changes direction. Because there is a moment in suffering when the soul understands that insisting on being understood by those who do not want to listen is prolonging the wound itself. And Job understands that his friends are no longer there to hear his truth, but to preserve an idea of God that does not allow for exceptions, and this perception leads him to a solitary and courageous decision. He will stop speaking to men and begin speaking directly to God. This decision does not stem from spiritual arrogance, but from a faith that refuses to be suffocated, because Job believes, even wounded, that the God he fears is greater than the caricatures his friends defend. And in declaring that he wishes to present his case before the Almighty, he is not trying to win a celestial debate, but to find a space where the truth can be spoken without fear. This reveals something profoundly human and spiritual at the same time, because when all mediation fails, when no human voice can bear the weight of the pain, only the desire to stand before the one who sees all remains. This choice is risky because it exposes the heart without guarantees, but it is also liberating because it returns to God the place that religious discourses had improperly occupied. Job then turns against the words of his friends with harsh clarity, calling them useless doctors, not out of personal contempt, but because he realizes that their words promise healing and deliver condemnation. This reveals an uncomfortable truth, that not all religious words are therapeutic, and that some consolations hurt more than silence, especially when the sufferer is treated as guilty without evidence. Job feels this as a second violence, because in addition to losing children, health, and social dignity, he now needs to defend his spiritual integrity against unfounded accusations. He understands that defending God through injustice is, in fact, distorting the very divine character, something his friends fail to see because they are more concerned with maintaining order than with hearing the truth. At this point, Job utters one of the most radical statements in the entire narrative, affirming that even if God kills him, he will still trust in him. This statement does not stem from empty resignation or spiritual heroism, but from a conscious decision not to compromise the truth for survival. Job understands that living in denial of who he is before God would be a greater death than physical death itself. Here, his faith reaches a level that no longer depends on results, as it is no longer anchored in the expectation of restoration, but in integrity. This profoundly confronts us because it reveals a faith that serves not to guarantee comfort, but to sustain identity when everything else falls apart. As we move forward, Job reveals that his desire is not to attack God, but to speak without being crushed by fear, asking only two simple and human things: that God remove the heavy hand that oppresses him, and that terror not prevent him from opening his mouth, because he knows that fear paralyzes the truth, and that no one can speak honestly when dominated by terror. This plea reveals a heart that still believes that God can hear, can dialogue, can allow space, and this is essential because Job does not want a summary judgment. He wants an encounter where the truth can emerge without him being destroyed by the weight of glory. This stance marks a silent but decisive change, because Job stops trying to control the interpretation of his own pain and accepts placing himself entirely before God, with all that he is: doubts, questions, fear, convictions, and integrity. And this prepares the ground for something that has not yet manifested itself. For when man abandons his defenses and presents himself completely, something begins to move in the invisible, even if the heavens remain silent for a while longer. Job doesn't know this, but his decision to speak directly with God is aligning his story with a purpose greater than any immediate explanation. Job remains steadfast in his choice, isolated from men, but turned towards heaven, willing to speak and also to listen, willing to defend his cause and accept whatever comes, because for him it no longer matters to preserve reputation or comfort. only to remain true before God. And this integrity, forged in the fire of pain, becomes the soil where something new will be born. For when faith ceases to depend on rewards and begins to depend only on truth, it becomes deeper, more dangerous, and more real. And although no answer has yet been given, the path to revelation has already begun to be traced in that heart that decided not to remain silent before God, even when everything around said that he should. Job's heart now moves through an even deeper territory, because when he speaks, he is no longer reacting to accusations, nor trying to organize a coherent argument to be accepted, but describing the human condition as someone who observes it from within, with the lucidity of one who has already lost everything he could lose, and his words sound like an ancient, almost universal lament, for he looks at his own existence and summarizes it in a simple and harsh way. Man born of woman is of few days, and full of trouble, and in this phrase there is more truth than despair. Because Job is not exaggerating his pain, he is recognizing the limit of human life, short, unstable, marked by anxiety, losses, and a constant sense of threat. And this awareness does not arise from cold philosophy. It arises from the direct experience of one who has seen prosperity evaporate like mist at dawn. Job then compares man to a flower that blooms and soon withers, to a shadow that passes and does not remain, images that carry both delicacy and sadness, because they reveal that the beauty of life lies precisely in its fragility. However, this same fragility becomes distressing when suffering is prolonged, and he wonders why God fixes his eyes on something so fleeting to bring him to judgment, as if to say that life is already too short to bear the weight of relentless vigilance. Here there is no direct accusation, only perplexity, for Job feels that the rigor seems disproportionate to the brevity of existence, and this touches a sensitive point in the human soul, the feeling that we are too small to endure such intense pain. By acknowledging that no one can take purity from what is impure, Job is not declaring himself wicked, but human, limited, flawed by nature. And by stating that man's days are numbered and his limits determined, he recognizes divine sovereignty over time and life, but also expresses a deep desire for relief, asking God to look away for a moment so that man may rest like a worker at the end of the day. And this image is powerful because it reveals that rest is seen as grace, not as a right, and that Job's greatest longing is no longer an explanation, but a pause, an interval in the weight of existence, a moment when pain does not need to be sustained with such force. At this point, Job observes nature and finds a painful contrast in it, for even a cut tree can sprout again at the scent of water, even when its trunk seems dead. But it is not so with man, for when he dies, where is he? This comparison does not arise from envy of the tree, but from the realization that human death seems too definitive, too silent, and by saying that man, once laid down, will not rise until the heavens cease to exist, Job expresses the perception of an absolute end, without yet, clearly seeing hope beyond the grave, and this reveals how much his pain still obscures any future vision, for his soul is trapped in the now, in the weight of the present, where everything seems to be heading only towards dust. Even so, there is an almost timid glimmer of hope when Job expresses the desire to be hidden in the grave until divine wrath passes, as if he were dreaming of a time when God would call him and he would answer. And this image is deeply moving because it reveals that even when speaking of death, Job does not wish to disappear from his relationship with God, but only to be preserved, guarded, remembered, and he imagines a scenario in which his sins would be sealed, his transgressions covered, not continually observed, and this desire points to something he does not yet fully understand, but which already pulsates within him, the hope that the relationship with God does not end in present pain. When Job returns to reality, his speech becomes heavy again, for he recognizes that just as water erodes stone and floods wash away the earth, man is slowly consumed until his hope dissolves. This image reinforces the idea of continuous wear and tear, not sudden destruction, but a progressive depletion where each day takes away a little more of his strength, his expectation, his joy. He concludes that God prevails over man, changing his countenance and sending him away, while his children continue living without him knowing whether they prosper or fall. This final separation intensifies the pain, because it reveals that death is not only the end of life, but the definitive break with everything that was loved. Thus Job concludes his speech, immersed in this awareness of human frailty, the brevity of days, and the harshness of existence when suffering is prolonged, not as someone who has abandoned faith, but as someone who can no longer sustain it with easy words, and his voice carries the weight of one who recognizes the limits of the human condition before a sovereign and mysterious God. And although there is no answer, no immediate consolation, nor visible relief, something essential remains: the raw honesty of a man who refuses to feign strength where only weariness exists, and who continues speaking not because he understands, but because he still stands before God, even when everything else seems inevitably to lead to silence. If this story resonated with you at any point, don't let it pass by in silence. Write in the comments, "I know that my Redeemer lives." This is not just a comment. It's a declaration of faith in the midst of pain, a way of saying that even without all the answers, you choose to trust in God's character. If you know someone who is going through suffering, silence, or spiritual confusion, share this video with them. Sometimes God doesn't send ready-made answers. He sends stories that sustain us. And if you want to continue your journey through the Bible in a deep, vibrant, and transformative way, subscribe to the channel. Here we don't shy away from difficult chapters because we know that God also speaks through them.